that discussion has to take into account the existing power of capital and the ruling class in the U.S. that defends and promotes them. But the film tomorrow is a film panel today is on varieties of socialism. We have three speakers who will be addressing different aspects of the topic that has been raised in many people's minds by the campaign of Bernie Sanders. As a democratic socialist, Bernie has put the word socialism back into the political vocabulary in the United States. In the reverse order, our speakers will be Joan Rollins, who is a political scientist. She's here actually doing a short course for the center this week on communitarian societies of the 19th century in the U.S. But she's done extensive historical research on that and socialist thought in general. Our second speaker will be Arturo Yarish, a retired high school teacher of history from New York City, and an active member of the People's Republic of Brooklyn.
Teachers Union chapter.
I'm Cliff Durand, a retired philosophy professor. I taught at Morgan State University in Baltimore for 40 years before retiring and then coming to San Miguel, where along with Bob Stone and his wife Betsy Bowman, we founded the Center for Global Justice as a research and learning center here in the Global South. I'll lead off the panel and then pass the baton to Arturo. Now, to our generation, or actually to anyone over 50, socialism means the state socialism of the former Soviet Union. And having come to political consciousness during the U.S. Cold War with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the anti-communist propaganda that flooded public discourse in those days, we learned that socialism was totalitarian, dictatorial, oppressive, and a host of other nasty things. Clearly, socialism, or communism, they were hardly distinguished, was a threat to the American way of life, defined as free enterprise and associated with democracy. It was through a politics of fear that our political elite mobilized popular support for its defense of capitalism. It was thus that the word socialism acquired a strongly negative connotation for our generation. Interestingly, that is not the case in the younger generation. According to polls, roughly half of those under 35 have a positive view of socialism and a negative view of capitalism. Socialism is shorn of its association with totalitarianism and even the state socialist variety of socialism. That's a striking turnaround and gives us older socialists hope for a more progressive future. It is that that drives Bernie Sanders' campaign. In an important November 19th speech at Georgetown University, Bernie sought to define socialism for the electorate. He did so not in terms of ideologies, but programmatically. It was a New Deal program that called for universal health insurance, free higher education at public universities, ending corporate personhood, breaking up the big banks, growing the trade union movement, raising taxes on the rich and corporations, etc. Significantly, his minimalist program is akin to Roosevelt's New Deal, which in his time capitalists called socialist. For them, anything is socialist that curtails their class power or runs counter to what today we call market fundamentalism. To most socialists today, that's a joke. Far from constituting socialism, such reforms that promote the common welfare by making life better for the popular classes only helps to save capitalism from the predatory capitalists who prevail today. That's hardly revolutionary, but it does point in the direction of socialism in the sense of public policies and institutions that promote the common good for collective, or by collective means. Let me show you Bernie's program. It's on the back of this T-shirt. He has a 12-step program.
Let's turn this way too.
Can someone read it out loud? I can't read it for you. Can you read it out loud?
They got to turn more. Rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure. 2, reversing climate change. 3, creating worker co-ops. 4, growing a trade union movement. 5, raising the minimum wage. 6, pay equity for women workers. 7, trade that benefits American workers. 8, making college affordable for all. 9, breaking up big Wall Street banks. 10, health care as a right for all. 11, expanding Social Security and Medicare. 12, raising taxes on the rich and corporations.
Well, significantly, in that list, Bernie did not call for public ownership of the means of production. He did not call for the expropriation of capital or the overthrow of the government. That is, he did not call for an end to capitalism. As long as capitalism exists, any progressive advance is subject to eventual reversal, as much of the accomplishment of the New Deal has been reversed. Certainly in today's political climate, even his minimal program is not easily achievable. That is why the program he outlined would require a political revolution, as he says. But by that he did not have in mind a violent uprising by the masses. Nothing like that is on the horizon. But a peaceful mobilization of citizens to take government back by their active participation in the political process, including, but not limited to, the electoral process. And the mood for that does exist today. Bernie knows that socialism is more than his minimalist New Deal program. But given the age of acquiescence, as one author has called it, that we live in, it's a good start. But it's only a start. It might bring us back to where this nation was at the end of Roosevelt's New Deal. In his last State of the Union address, FDR put forward an economic Bill of Rights, the second Bill of Rights. He called on the country to guarantee a job with a living wage to everyone, a decent home, adequate health care, a good education, economic protection in old age, sickness and accident, and unemployment. This call was based on a national consensus that had been born from a decade-long struggle against the insecurity of the Great Depression and the national unity of World War II. This was an understanding that we are all interconnected and have a social responsibility to ensure basic security for all. This consensus should have made possible a wave of progressive legislation in the post-war period, a wave that could have chipped away at the power of capital. And well it might, had the political leadership of the country been responsive to the popular will. But the political elite had a different agenda in mind. At FDR's last nominating convention, the party establishment had denied him his chosen running mate, Henry Wallace, who was the incumbent in that position. A strong advocate of progressive social policies and of continuing the war-era alliance with the Soviet Union, Henry Wallace was anathema to the pro-capitalist party bigwigs who manipulated the convention to deny Wallace the nomination, knowing that he would soon become president since Roosevelt was not expected to live long. As Oliver Stone and Peter Krusnick have documented, that is how we got the anti-communist Harry Truman and the Cold War. We also didn't get the Economic Bill of Rights that could have moved the country further along the road to an American socialism. Nevertheless, the social liberalism of the New Deal remained hegemonic among Democratic politicians and voters alike until the late 1970s. It was the basis of President Johnson's Great Society program, which sought to extend the New Deal. It even informed the Republican administration of Richard Nixon, who declared himself a Keynesian. It was also under Nixon that we got the Environmental Protection Agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Indeed, Nixon was the last liberal president we have had. We didn't think of him as that at the time, but in hindsight, he was the last in that liberal tradition. Bernie hopes to be the next one. Well, implicit in what I've been saying is a historical view that sees socialism as something that comes not from a sudden conquering of state power, but from a long process of building, piece by piece, public institutions that point toward socialism. That's the way capitalism was built over the course of centuries. It is a process that step by step empowers people collectively and increases their independence from capital. It builds toward an eventual rupture from capitalism, whether by peaceful or by violent means. History will only tell. The form of the resulting socialism, if that is what it is even called eventually, will be shaped by the means by which we build it. Let me conclude by briefly focusing on step 3 in Bernie's 12-step program, creating worker co-ops. Worker-owned, self-managed cooperatives are businesses that operate in a market. In themselves, they are compatible with a capitalist economy. But they differ from private businesses in that their profits are shared among their worker members, who democratically decide how the co-op is run. There's no exploitation by outside owners, nor are they subject to direction from unaccountable managers. Individual interest is linked to the collective interest. The individual good is achieved through the common good. This fosters cooperative social relations among members. It is in this sense that co-ops point toward socialism. They foster values and a consciousness that moves beyond capitalism. Thus, they can become stepping stones toward a future political movement that could eventually challenge the domination of capital. That is why co-ops are the most significant part of Bernie's democratic socialism. The other steps are basically reforms of capitalism that can cushion its impact on us, but do not threaten the rule of capital. But cooperatives can build in the nooks and crannies of today's society the beginnings of an alternative to capitalism. That's the place where at least we can start for now. Okay. Arturo?
Thank you. I hope I followed you well and expand on it. You've given me a lot to work with.
I have to speak louder.
This is not part of his striptease program.
Yeah.
That comes later. I'd like to key off Cliff's comment that socialism will be an integral and long process. Its formation doesn't come from what we have to say to you or to small groups of people. It comes from the material productive process that Cliff alluded to, that Bob and Betsy have often written about, called, by Marx, the voluntary control of the associated producers. This is where the substance of what Machiavelli called from me to you, and you to me, or from each of us to all of us, much maligned Machiavelli. In order to stimulate that discussion among small groups or large groups, I would like to propose a three-step approach today, which all of you teachers will recognize as a kind of mutation of a developmental lesson. But they are functional and purposeful. Therefore, what I would like to do is share with you the discussion questions that I have prepared as an outline. However, first, I think it's most important to hear what you think as opposed to what we think, so that we create a dynamic discussion in the spirit, Freirean spirit of participation, action in democracy. Therefore, I would like to ask you, for those of you who care to respond, what is socialism to you? Please inform us. Please inform each other. What is socialism for you? What are the elements? Are they the elements of Roosevelt's 12 points? Does it go somewhere beyond and more deeply than cooperatives? Can it? May I have a few spontaneous responses? Just right off the top of your head. Yes?
Sure. I'll come at it from maybe a different perspective, because we're Canadians, second generation socialist Canadians, raised successfully, third generation. So for us, it's daily bread. It's my husband is a steel worker in the union. I have a degree in labor relations. So it's like every day for us. I mean, we grew up with it. It was we never thought about it as something that's different. It was part of our lives, and I think for us that means a strong social safety net. We would prefer to see government-owned, government-run transportation, telephone lines, utility infrastructure. That isn't necessarily the case, of course, in Canada. But I mean, I think it just doesn't seem. Cliff said anybody over 50. Well, we're well over 50, but we've lived it. We grew up with it, and we don't think of it as anything different, or we just think of that's the way it should be. So it's just probably a little bit different take on what many other people here or U.S. citizens might think of it.
Maybe the Canadians will educate their southern neighbors. We have lost a long thread of our education. Would anyone else care to make a comment? What is socialism to you? Would you comment on what is said? And let's create a bit of a dynamic people-to-people discussion. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I guess I would question the old ruling class of philanthropists who, you know, some of them today, for example, Warren Buffett or Koch brothers, who instead of being philanthropists and giving, and some of them are, by the way, thinking of Warren Buffett and
Gates.
malaria and other things that he's been known for, but they've gotten so involved in our elections that they're buying who we can have as candidates, let alone as qualified leaders. So that would be a great concern to me, how that is going to ever be stopped with campaign finance reform. We've heard about that before for years, and so I'd like to have that addressed.
Other comments, please. Yes.
Yes, I'd just like to point out that true, complete democracy under capitalism is impossible. That capitalism exercises control over policy to an undue extent, especially the large corporations, whereas under socialism, the economy as well as politics would be more completely democratic.
Would it be correct to say that, to interpret you very briefly in relation to what you said, that capitalism is anathema to democracy? Would others care to add to, introduce new ideas? Yes, sir.
I'd be interested in knowing, since I assume probably about 50% are Canadians, which of the 12 characteristics on Bernie's list that you've grown up with, that you've lived with, and you feel comfortable with? So which ones in particular? Cliff has got them loaded.
Public healthcare system. Probably our trade union system is probably stronger than the Social Security, Medicare. So it's a social safety net that we have, that we don't argue on ideological grounds.
We have started in the United States, but not have gone as
Still
far.
moving towards something like that.
We also have affordable university education compared to yours, in that our tuition ranges from $5,000 to $8,000 a year, depending on the province, the university, and the program. Whereas I understand that, and these are the really top universities, we're not talking about, anyway. Whereas I understand it's a lot more expensive in the United States, but it's still not free. And I'd love to see it free, but I don't think I'd like to pay the taxes that would require.
How about climate change? That's number 2 on the list.
Coming, isn't it? Stefan Dion's in there working hard at it, isn't he?
Our previous government was a huge laggard on this one. The current government has changed.
Under Trudeau.
I've got a different perspective, and this is a challenge, up to a point, challenge to me, challenge to you. I share some of the desires, but I'm an economist by training. I think there isn't really an alternative to capitalism. It's really a case of making capitalism as positive a force and as accountable, et cetera, as possible. So that's just a challenge to having a dialogue with some of you. And it means that some things that you believe in, I don't, but you know, I'm still here because I do share with you many things about making the world a better place. But I kind of fundamentally, we diverge at some point about whether or not capitalism at the end has a true alternative in a democratic environment. and whether or not its ending is really desirable. But beyond that, I do want to be here and be part of a discussion and through dialogue, so you might have to just bear with me that particular cross I carry and be one of the written stuff.
Others, yes, sir, before I'd like to go on.
Well, my education of socialism was spending time in southern Brazil where they have social democrats, and then going to Cuba where socialism is the state is socialism, and there's very little private property that's slowly changing. And I thought one of the things about socialism was that you tried to prevent this economic boom crash cycle. And now Brazil is going into a very deep recession, hyperinflation period, and it's almost as if the Workers' Party, who's been in control in the north, who's controlled the national politics, have bought into a lot of neoliberalism, including a petro state, and now with the price of petroleum down and selling raw materials and food to China has also lost so much of its economy, and it's shrinking. And so I wonder what is the difference between a steady state economy versus one that is still tied into a capitalist boom and bust cycle.
Well, I would like to continue with your comments for the limited time that I have. I would just like to make a couple of comments to give us a little bit of direction. As we look to the state, we should remember that the fascists, excuse me,
Yeah, just louder.
I'll put on my teacher voice so you won't miss a word or an inflection. We should reflect very carefully that the Nazis and the fascists had statist programs which came out of the work of early capitalists in the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, in which they called organized or managed capitalism. The people who put together the Federal Reserve Bank in secret meetings in 1907 were prime advocates of that. That's why reflecting on Bob's work and Cliff's reference to Bob and Betsy's work on the formation of cooperatives is fundamentally important. But again, I step back to leave the space to you. Anyone else? May I? Yes, sir.
Well, you first asked what we think of socialism, and
Could you speak up?
I think socialism has a connotation or a meaning of state control. We've been living through a period where the term liberal, in fact, has been so demonized as being a dirty word that to go from there to socialism is a huge step. Now, Bernie's program, as Cliff said, does not include government control, but it increases government influence in an era in the United States where the government is being vilified. Now, maybe Hillary is in a tough spot. She is trying to point out that that Bernie's programs, while they may have been very valuable and important, just could not get through our political system. Our Congresses would never agree to these steps, which many think would eventually lead to full government control.
Therefore, we have to address the issue of what will be the popular force to put pressure on currently elected representatives to bring about a change. And part of that force is inherent in the formation of a new set of working relationships within business, within government, and outside.
We have to change Congress. We have to change the Congress.
Perhaps the whole concept and the working operations of democracy itself. Because yes, sir.
I think looking back that some of us went to school like in the early 60s or before that, we were taught that socialism, including Germany and all, because they look like they're doing so well, would collapse under their own weight, right? Then you get into the late 60s, early 70s when you finally get there, and you figure, well, geez, 10 years ago they were supposed to collapse. They're not doing bad. Now, what it is a lot of people in this room probably did the same thing. When you studied and looked into things, you made an existential leap, but it's always done individually. This is such a big thing for a whole country to make a shift like that, that it's almost unbelievable how it's going. Not saying it is right, but how the people are going to do that, and somehow the middle ground has to be found. Because we went from the 70s, the 80s they were doing better, and now Germany is doing quite well, considering all the problems they have, but economically, what they have is they're a management level. The person working in the trades or whatever you're doing, whoever's managing you to hold down, their ratio to employee is so much lower than ours. So the word social, they are more social in themselves. Maybe because they're a homogeneous society that's tied in, and it's easier to work that way, and you can do certain things than us, a smorgasbord of different nationalities. But they have seemed to succeeded in 70 years.
May I continue with a few questions? I hate to cut this, but Cliff's going to tell me I went over my time. And then recognize that this is a profoundly important discussion which goes far beyond the politics of pale pink Bernie. We have to expand this discussion among ourselves. Contributing in a small way to that, I would like to propose a series of questions, not to be limited to those questions, but just as stimulating questions. And if we can have a question-answer session, I would like to expand on them with you. You have given your perspective on what is socialism and what it may convey. And in my opinion, there are not a variety of socialisms. There are two controlling influences: needs of people and how those needs are fulfilled in a democratic fashion, controlled by the workers, by the people who produce to meet needs. Needs fulfillment is the direction of socialism. And that is what we have to figure out how to do together, because socialism by itself implies a social project of development. It's not the union members seeking only higher wages. It's union members fulfilling needs of all types, whether they're medical needs, transportational needs, in relation to community needs, of which we, whether we're teachers, steel workers, or doctors or nurses, are intending to do with a social consciousness. Therefore, I just propose a few questions to you. I would very much appreciate if someone, or if you would take the notes on the questions, so, or I can later repeat them, of course. Can we predict what socialism should be? Bernie has his 12 points. That is a social democratic process and project. Does that reflect our fundamental needs or our beginning needs? Is it our starting point? Is it our end point? Can we predict what socialism should be, ought to be, will be? I would like to hear some responses so that we can build this discussion. What are, or would be, the social, economic, cultural features of a new historic form, as Marx called it? Marx didn't talk very much about socialism. They wrote the Communist Manifesto but he was not willing to talk about what had not formed. He knew it had to be built, and that was their project. That's our project. He called it the new historic form. If we refer to Gramsci's terminology, a completely different, non-antagonistic, hegemonic alternative. I submit an idea that a new social hegemonic alternative, completely opposed to the hegemony of capital, not capitalism, capital, must be qualitatively different. What will form the qualitative difference? How will we shape that qualitative difference? What will be the substantive differences? Why must the new historic form, as Cliff said, we're not sure if it's even going to be called socialism. I think that's why Marx is very judicious when he says there's going to be a new historic form. Even though they wrote the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels. How might we contribute to the creation of this new set? There must be a new set of social relations. No matter how progressive a union member may be, a steel worker or me, a teacher, if we do not control the working environment in relation to the needs of the community, capital controls it. Capital dictates the terrorism under its authority in the workplace. We remain nothing but the pawns on the board. Every once in a while, going to vote for a lesser evil. What is the meaning then of creating the new historic form, which implies a new set of metabolic social reproductive relationships? Metabolic social reproductive relationships. Where do we go? How do we know where to go? A lot of creative people in this audience thinking. How do we make that journey? And what will be the fundamental principles that we know we must adhere to? The fundamental principles of capitalism are both active and passive. The market determines behavioral economics, if you will. In the new economic order, human beings will have to determine their future. And I guess we better get started. And I look forward to your questions and your comments during this session.
And now Jones Wolf.
I want to start with two commercials. First of all, my major field of research is the influence of philanthropy on public policy. So you may be interested in that. I have a book called Foundations in Public Policy, The Mask of Pluralism. Just look up Joan Roloffs on Google and you'll find that. The other thing I want to say is that Bernie doesn't speak very much about the military-industrial complex, which is probably my major concern at the moment, rather than free education, which I believe in. But I think this is more of an issue. I will, however, be talking about that next month here, February 10th, I believe it is. Yeah. So, what I want to say, please tell me if I'm not talking loud enough. I believe we can learn a lot from history. what worked in the past and what hasn't worked. In terms of our own values, when I say worked, I mean what institutions have promoted justice and equality and freedom and all the other values we enjoy, such as, of course, environmental protection too. I've been much influenced by French socialism, early pre-Marxist socialism. In the original sense, socialism meant eliminating all of the institutions that caused misery, not just the economic ones. The early socialists, of course, questioned capitalism, but they also questioned many other institutions that were causing misery, including the state, including war, armies, and also marriage, the family, organized religion, many other things. They were very radical. They were influenced by the Enlightenment. Marx and Engels appreciated this view, this holistic view of what socialism is. But along the way, Marxism has faded out this holistic conception of socialism up to today's theorists. And that's true of both the social democratic side and the communist side of socialism. Both of them have narrowed too much to economic needs rather than looking at everything. The early socialists, the early French socialists, but also others, felt that the French Revolution was a progressive thing, but it did not go far enough. They said that marriage, private property, and organized religion were all barriers to liberty, equality, and fraternity. They were saying, in effect, that democracy was incompatible with capitalism, that you would never have democracy if you had such tremendous wealth and monopolies and so much control over workers and so much poverty, which deprived people of the ability to participate in government. Even if they were permitted to do so, they didn't have the resources. So that was the origin of socialism, and I think sometimes we can go back to that early period for some hints as to what we want. But times and circumstances have changed a lot. We also know a lot about human nature and what people will put up with and how they will react under communal living and all kinds of things. So I think that there are issues that a modern-day socialism has to deal with. And I'm going to talk about a number of the questions I have that relate to applying older concepts of socialism to today. First of all, of course, we need to figure out what constitutes the good life. What do we want socialism to accomplish? Then we have to analyze what the current barriers are to a decent existence for all, for everyone all over the world, not just in the developed countries. Because any kind of socialism that we create has to take into account that we want the equality for people in the whole world, not necessarily exact equality, but we certainly want everyone in the world to have a decent, full existence. How can we create a socialism that will promote that? While, of course, preserving what's left of the environment. We also have to look at the world and people as they are, not as we think they should be. So the first question I have is this. The economy that we seek to transform today, increasingly throughout the whole world, more so in the developed countries, is composed of service industries. To what extent is workers' control appropriate for education, health care, or social services? Who should be making policy in those fields? Should the teachers be determining what the curriculum is in school? Tourism is reputedly the largest industry in the world. How can this become a socialized industry? And should it? There is a problem, two problems with tourism, although of course here we all are. One is the problem of the nature of the work of serving tourists, servicing tourists. And the second problem is the environmental stress that tourism actually creates. So there's a question of what shall we do about such an industry if we have a socialist society? Should we just say, well, it'll be socialist as long as the workers in the industry have control of councils? No, we may have to change the whole structure of the economy. Other very lucrative industries, very important industries, certainly in the United States, are pornography, drugs, including pharmaceuticals, military equipment of all kinds, computer games, and privatized intelligence services. Those are the growing industries in the United States. They're very lucrative. What would workers' control mean in those fields? Would workers vote to eliminate their occupation? Again, throughout the whole world, really, an increasing part of the economies consist of non-governmental organizations of all kinds. That includes both charities and political movements. How are these to be socialized? So many people have jobs in those industries. Then many of these nonprofits are actually working to supplement our dysfunctional market system. And at the same time, they do improve people's lives to some extent, but they reduce the impetus for radical change, just as the New Deal reforms. Also, the enormous amount, including even some of Bill Gates' work, but enormous amount of the Ford Foundation supporting the arts. If not for the foundations, our art scene would be punk rock or whatever it is, pretty much. It's the only thing that pays for itself. Other kinds of art, whether it's classical or folk or ethnic, is entirely subsidized, or not entirely, but heavily subsidized by foundations and donations. It doesn't, the market would not pay for them. So what do you do with that? How do you create another system? The other important factor in today's world is that globalization, which Marx and Engels considered a progressive force, makes local economic control nearly impossible. Multinational corporations are not easily tamed. It may be that only a local economy can be both socialist and ecologically sound. And that, again, was the view of Charles Fourier, a great critic of civilization, one of the early French socialists. A local economy was what he thought was the only way to do socialism. And we can learn about how that worked from the experience of 19th and 20th century communitarian movements, how communal ownership and living worked out. I think that collective consumption can certainly be a way that the desire for things can be fulfilled with a less drastic strain on the environment. Because it's often said, well, in the first world we have all these gadgets and things, and people in the third world want them, and we can't build a society that denies them what we have. One way we can deal with that is to show by people who have the resources. That everyone doesn't have to have an individual lawnmower and hi-fi and all sorts of other things, even cars, that can be shared. And this could be a model for the development of poorer countries too. Another question is, how in a socialist society should the allocation of resources be determined? The market is not likely to provide results in accordance with socialist values, especially if advertising is to be permitted as a form of expression. So years ago, I had a debate with a man who was actually an employee of the Communist Party, and he thought market socialism was the way to go, and he believed in democratic socialism. Democratic socialism means you have free speech, freedom of expression. But if that freedom of expression extends to advertising, the market is going to be very distorted even in a purely socialist society. The advertising could persuade people to buy things they don't need because the workers' cooperative that produces it wants business. And if you say, well, we have to reduce, I have to compete with that. I think the CIA put that on.
I think you have to get up and dance. You have to get up and dance.
I'll get up and dance. Okay, so this question again about whether workers' cooperatives would be willing to shut down their own industries if their industries were dangerous or frivolous. Then there's the question of whether democracy is compatible with socialism. I think it may not be, because socialists seek a rational allocation of resources, not just what the majority will wants. Furthermore, it takes time to transform an economy, and an annual or even 5-year shifts in public opinion would create havoc in a society that was trying to transform itself. People were voting every year or even every 5 years on the economic plan, which is, it's a democratic way of doing it. The other question is, even if grassroots democracy worked out well for the economy, there's a question of whether the majority would vote to protect the environment or the long-term needs of a society, future generations, for example, or the needs of those who, for any reason, just don't have an active voice in the system. In the socialist countries, the former socialist countries, meritocracy rather than democracy was the system. There was considerable social mobility, especially in the initial phases of building new societies. There's tremendous social mobility. But this is not what we call equality. This is not even equality of opportunity, because some people start out in life with natural and social advantages, and that was even true in the communist countries. I mean, people there did better in terms of social mobility than in the United States, where who your parents were is the major determinant of where you end up. But still, there were a lot of advantages people had in those communist countries, including the fact that some were just smarter or whatever. You see, socialists tend to think that all misery and inequality comes from the environment. But I'm not sure that we can rule out heredity totally. And we have to think about that. I'm not saying it's of no concern. It's not a factor. The environment is not a factor, but there may be some inheritable advantages people have. How do we deal with that? It's not impossible, but the question is, if we want equality, we don't just mean equality of opportunity, which a meritocracy provides, but equality of result. The other thing is that the communist systems, the socialist systems, even the communitarian societies, wanted to transform people into a new socialist person or a new Christian person or a new good person. And this has implications of social engineering. It has implications of manipulation, which is not consonant with our wishes for a democratic socialist society. Do we need to do that in order to have a socialist society? Do we have to transform people through early education, propaganda, whatever methods of social engineering we have? Because if we do, then we have to say, well, it isn't going to be completely democratic. Then there's the question about marriage and the family. Is marriage a feudal institution that's incompatible with democracy or socialism? Is marriage private property in persons? Marriage is actually disappearing worldwide. In many places it hardly ever existed as we understand it. Is the family fulfilling its traditional functions adequately? Or is it so oppressive and inadequate that better institutions should gradually replace it? Then, socialist projections should not ignore the aging of the population. What does this mean for an economy? Who will care for the elderly and infirm? Should retirement be abolished and replaced with part-time work, or work for everyone in accordance with their ability? Socialist theories such as George Bernard Shaw and Andre Gorz have proposed a short period of socially required work for everyone, and the rest of the time for creative pursuits, fishing, or doing nothing, as one desires. That was their idea of socialist society. You have the essential work would be done in very short periods, and people afterwards could either do nothing or add to their stuff by doing more. But then there's the question about fishing altogether. How should socialists use other animals or the rest of the natural world? Is the need to save what's left of the environment compatible with democratic processes? Then there's the question of whether all the socialist theories, are they inherently imperialistic? Both the Marxist and the Fabian traditions appear to assume that the means of production acquire resources from the hinterlands, whether domestic or overseas, and distribute finished products to both local and foreign markets. We have to deal, how would we deal with the issue of guest workers under a socialist society? Then we have to understand social psychology. What incentives are there in our population for radical change? And historically, socialist movements waned when enthusiasm for owning the means of production disappeared when full employment and welfare state benefits emerged. This especially was the case very vividly in England, in Great Britain. I actually wrote my doctoral dissertation on British socialism and what happened to it. And that was, the workers lost enthusiasm for socialism. The people who maintained enthusiasm were middle-class intellectuals who liked it ideologically. They weren't even going to gain anything under socialism. They would probably be poorer, but they loved the idea of it. They wanted socialism. But the workers were quite content with what they got, and socialism died out. Okay. I will just say one more thing about social psychology. that all socialist experiments were created in a capitalist context. And the children and grandchildren of those socialists wanted to be like their grandparents, make radical changes, and they wanted to go the other way. And that's what, so the question is, what's to prevent that from repeating itself in a future socialist society? And I would agree, I certainly agree with Cliff, that the first useful step is to build socialist institutions inside of current societies, study what has worked in the past, including, as a tribute to where we are, the Institute of Public Libraries, for example, in the United States, an interlibrary loan, and libraries are now lending out electronics and tools. And they were so much admired by the Bolsheviks in the 1920s that they said, we have to have that kind of system. We're not going to have huge libraries. We're going to have interlibrary loan like they have. So I would look at all sources of inspiration to see what kind of institutions work, including possibly many of the New Deal type of institutions. Okay.
Okay, we have a lot to think about and talk about there. Anyone have a question or comment they'd like to start off with? Okay.
Mine's so simplistic, I apologize, but when I tell my friends at home that I'm a socialist, quote unquote, they say, I'm not going to pay for that. I don't want my taxes to rise. And how do you convince people who want to vote for Bernie, who may want to vote for Bernie, or know I'm voting for Bernie, to convince them that it's not going to cost them a fortune? I'm starting to be a capitalist at this point, and I guess I am in a way, because I'm a citizen here, I'm in the States. But after that beautiful, wonderful talk of yours, this is so simplistic, I apologize. But that's what I hear from people at home.
Okay, we'll come to that.
Okay.
There were some other hands. Let's have several.
The last speaker touched on a lot of ambiguities and the contradictions. Okay. You go back to Marx and stuff, and we talked a lot about contradictions of capitalism, but I think you touched on a lot of contradictions in socialism. In part, the fact that with Marx especially, it very much focused on materialism. And in fact, perhaps more of the socialists in the world are much more spiritual, value-based, socially, to the point where, part of me, as a young person, possibly attracted a little bit, realized that to some degree socialism, the people who really believed in it, it's religion. It's a religion.
Yes.
More than a materialism. And so I think some of the aspects of Marxist theory about materialism and interpretation about material needs is really misplaced, because in fact what you really want to do is re-engineer humans to be much more nicer and caring people.
Yes. Yeah.
And how do you do that? And that's entirely unclear, and certainly unclear whether any socialist regime has ever managed to achieve that. And perhaps you need to look at Buddhism and almost the rejection of material wants to really achieve that. What does Buddhism achieve materially? Very little, actually, in most Buddhism. It's really about rejection of materialism. And these are not really well-to-do countries, although Nepal, apparently on some index of happiness, is the happiest country in the world. That's great. Maybe that's what more profitable perspective to take. How to make people better people. There's no, what as parents you all want to do. Does it matter if you put a label of capitalism, socialism, Buddhism? Aren't you trying to get people to be good human beings who care about other people and responsible to the
I
world?
want to respond to that. I agree with you. I don't think Marx had a very good conception of human nature.
Mm-hmm.
He thought the workers would want to revolt, run the means of production. I don't think he really knew much about what workers really wanted. I'm very much, as I said, interested in the French socialists. They had more of a holistic idea, and they also were in some ways creating a religion to substitute for the Catholic religion that had been destroyed in many ways, partially destroyed in the French Revolution. So they were looking for a new religion. And one of the French socialists was Victor Considerant, who wrote a socialist manifesto that was published in 1843. And I translated this, there's another commercial coming, I translated this into English for the first time. So if you look up Victor Considerant, Joan Roloffs, you'll see the translations. The short manifesto is about 80 pages long. And it gives a much more, it's more of a Christian socialist perspective. And it's a lot about making people good and with New Deal reforms too. And anti-capitalist against the monopolies. Not against all private property though. Because in France, many of the workers and peasants really wanted to own small businesses, little workshops, little shops, little farms. They weren't so interested in running large means of production. They were happy enough if the state ran the railways, which it did. They didn't want monopolies, but they liked the idea of small business. They weren't against private property. And neither was Considerant or Fourier for that matter. So you might look into those very neglected philosophers.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to come back to the question that Jackie raised. Social democracy isn't going to cost too much. Okay. We think of social democracy or democratic socialism, as many of you said in responding to Arturo earlier, in terms of a social safety net. But related to that is also the existence of public institutions, public provision of various needs collectively rather than just individually. For example, in some books, you could say that I was born in a public hospital, a socialist institution. I went to a public school, a socialist institution, public provision of education. Went to a university, public. I went to a public library. We had public roads that we could travel on. Public fire department, police force, public water system. And now I'm under a public retirement program, Social Security. In fact, our lives are supported in many ways, from birth to the very end, by public institutions. And that's a part of what socialism represents. Now, does that cost too much? Well, right now, under neoliberal market fundamentalism, a lot of those things are being privatized. Hospitals are being taken over and made into profit centers, and the cost of healthcare goes up. We have private universities, for-profit universities, more expensive. Water systems are being privatized. Even roads are being privatized.
Prisons.
Yeah, so what we're seeing is capitalism trying to take things that were publicly provided and make them into commodities from which they can extract a profit. And it increases the cost to us, the users of those benefits. So I think there you can find an answer to those who say, well, Bernie's program of social provision is going to cost too much. No, as he points out, for example, with reference to universal single-payer health care, it's going to cost less. It's going to cost less because you won't have the private insurance companies with their bureaucratic structure increasing the cost, not to mention the profits that the shareholders in those insurance companies require, and the high salaries of the CEOs, etc. all of that's eliminated. If you look at the administrative costs of Social Security and compare it with the administrative costs of private health insurance, you know it's the public provision that is much more efficient.
I'd like to respond to you, John. First of all, on a very positive note of concordance, there is no question of the fundamental importance to all of us in our understanding, evaluation, analysis of history. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the implication in your summarial presentation is a static view of unchanging conditions in which social change may take place. I'll just give two examples. One is tourism. The dynamics of tourism could be far greater than we understand it today, especially under the monumental control of private corporations. Under changed circumstances, changed employment, changed social perspectives which we would infuse, we could create, and people would create for themselves, new concepts of educational tourism, relaxation in a changed concept of free time. It's very important, for example, that we know that capitalism has a notion of free time in relation to time on the job, so to speak. A new concept might be what is socially disposable time, where people perform functions that are very efficient, hopefully in a shorter period of time, and the implications of tourism, whether it's to visit a museum in the neighborhood or to visit a museum 5,000 miles away, on the invitation of a coordinating group. We, I think, and as I said, correct me if I'm wrong, if I misread the implication, but as we create new conditions of work, as we resolve some of the problems that you pointed to, we create entire new cultural concepts.
Okay, I want to just reply to that. First of all, George Bernard Shaw said he didn't mind washing dishes for 15 hours a week, and then he could do something else. So labor could be done that way. So the menial labor would be shared by people who would do other things in their time. But the other problem is the environmental impact of tourism. There's automobile, there's airplane, but it turns out that even backpackers are destroying the world. So that is a major concern about tourism, the traveling itself.
Now, there are other people who want to speak. Okay, Bob?
I just wanted to address two distinct questions. One was Arturo's, how do we make this journey to a place beyond capital? And Joan's question of whether co-ops will dissolve themselves if they produce harmful things. It's important to remember that the market fundamentalism that guides us is based on a faith. The faith is that if we each pursue our own interest, not me, pursue our own interest in a marketplace where everyone is free to interact and exchange, then the public good will be served there also as unseen hand. Now that's mystery, that's faith. This unseen hand is going to serve the public. Well, we're seeing the market failures now. Neoliberal market fundamentalism is coming to a halt. So how do we conceive of this journey? Well, I submit that we already have a very clear alternative to pursuing our own interests in a free market, and that is the family. Cliff spoke of how worker co-ops pursue the needs of their members. Yes, they do pursue profit in a capitalist context, but in order to meet the needs of their members. That's supposed to be what families do. You got a need, we're gonna get behind it and meet it. That's the theory. So, and that's not mysterious. We understand the economics of families very quickly and easily, and much more clearly than we do those of marketplaces. So we don't have to be so puzzled about this socialist idea. We know what socialism is. It's just that it's repressed. You get into the market, you got to sell yourself. There's a huge transformation. I remember my niece packaging herself for her first job interviews. That didn't come naturally. Now, I just wanted to ask, just ponder this question of, suppose you got a destructive industry like tourism or well, the case that comes to my mind is the beedi factories. Anyone know what a beedi is?
Those Indian cigarettes that look like little cigars.
In the Kerala state of India, most socialist state of India, there are huge numbers of cooperatives make all sorts of stuff, including little beedies. These are tiny little cigarettes, potent tobacco thing. Now, here you got a cooperative producing something terrible. Don't you have to engineer these people? This point came up, transform them into good people. Well, I think you have to think through what cooperative production is. It really is non-capitalist. It's not aimed at interests. It's aimed at needs. And those beedi factories wouldn't like not to harm their clients. And I think that we have to see that cooperatives, in the end, would allow this built-in fellow feeling that's suppressed and diverted and exploited by capitalism to come out. How would guest workers be accommodated? Well, wait a minute. Guest workers are created in large measure by the dominance of the world economy by capital. The requirement to make money for someone who accumulates capital in order to get your needs met. Well, suppose you directly go for meeting needs instead of going through capital accumulation. One of those needs is for a stable family life. Why couldn't you secure that and not have guest workers? We're seeing the crisis of refugees right now, which is unthinkable without all these countries competing to plead to the god capital, come alight on my terrain. You don't need guest workers, you don't need beedies, you don't need drugs if you've got fulfillment of communities that are based on meeting needs, which we're very familiar with.
Okay, in the back, there was a hand.
Yeah, I have a question. I don't know if any of you have read Jeremy Rifkin's book about the shared economy, but he talks about things like Uber or home exchange, or there's a multitude of ways that people share through the internet, and I'd just be curious if any of you could comment on that. I think that's a...
Yeah, I can say that, yes, this is certainly happening. And it's very good to show it as a model for poorer countries, so they don't feel that they have to satisfy their population by everyone having a car, for example. In China, everyone was going to want a car in China. Can you imagine that? And we can't just say, well, it's all right for them to share, but we have to have our own. We have to show that we share and that we have a good life, even with sharing a lot of things, with not having so many individual things. Yeah.
Okay, Chris.
I wanted to ask Joan the relationship, she spoke of the socialist movement pre-Marx.
Yes.
And then the socialist movement that was in the French underground with Sartre and these other people during World War II. Because they professed themselves, I assume, as communists, but was there some kind of influence from previous?
Well, of course, the existentialists tended to be Marxists. But in 1968, with the student revolutions, Fourier came to be revived because there was a movement of anarchist type of socialism. And Fourier certainly was a representative of that. Fourier didn't believe in the state or armies or bureaucracies. He thought socialism was people living in small communities which would affiliate with all the other communities all over the earth. And national governments were the trouble and made war. So the early socialists were also very much opposed to war. They didn't like revolution either. They didn't want any violent revolution. They didn't want any violence. They were communitarian socialists to some extent. And that was, of course, that related very much to anarchism, which never died out completely, but it flowered in 1968 in Paris with the student revolts there.
And what about
with Occupy Wall Street?
Yeah.
And what about the farmers markets and buying local or something? Is that related to that? Communitarian sort of?
Well, I think it's very important as an environmental movement. I myself was a red-green, and I'm very much concerned with the environment, and I could do another commercial about that. Because I wrote a book called Greening Cities, where I talk a lot about those developments. And I think they're wonderful developments, but I don't think they are going to lead to socialism. I mean, they may eventually, but they rather help capitalist society. The same thing, the autonomous movement in Germany was very helpful to absorb the energies of the young radicals and to provide employment for them. And it worked well with capitalism because it got rid of those people in a way. They had these wonderful projects, they loved them, but they weren't advancing towards socialism. So I don't think I think localvore is good in itself, but I don't know whether it will produce socialism. I mean, there are cooperatives too. My daughter belongs to a fishing cooperative. Cooperative fishery. It's like, and she pays for a share and gets whatever the fisher people bring in. And if the weather is bad, they don't go out, and the people accept that, and they like that. I mean, it's a wonderful thing. There's fishery cooperatives, but and I think we should encourage that. But I don't know if we're going to get to socialism that way. Yeah.
Yes, in the back.
What do you think the connection is between socialism and culture? For instance, Marxism and fascism had an awful effect on the quality of culture, with a few exceptions. Capitalism, in the beginning, had a great positive effect on culture. And that I mean art, architecture, music, poetry, education. This room, this institution with full of books, literature, poetry, and so on. That's the substance of our civilization.
I'd like to speak to that.
Okay.
First of all, I would not subscribe to a blanket condemnation of
the negative impact of Marxism on culture. We can cite many examples. We can cite many examples of the stimulation of culture. For example, just in Cuba alone, the emergence of popular culture as a national expression. The entire program of the Italian Communist Party under Togliatti, when Togliatti succeeded at the end of the war, the entire program of the Italian Communist Party under difficult circumstances was not to confront the United States-supported Christian Democrats, but they created a nationwide program of culture under the banner of l'Unità, under the program of stimulating and revising popular culture. Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci himself gave
one example.
Pirandello alone. Pirandello alone.
What about Malkovich being sent to the
go
Gulag?
to all Gramsci's articles in L'Ordine Nuovo, go to l'Unità, just as one example. We see the same thing in Spain, right under the fascist Franco, and in Puerto Rico, until recently, where culture was commercialized. Almost all we see from the revival of seis as a musical form, the revival of plena bomba, the entire poetic movement of Puerto Rico was a national phenomenon which exists today, and everyone in this room probably wish they could dance salsa in a Puerto Rican fashion. We can go on and on in every country. Look what happened in the United States. Who were the promoters of popular culture? It was suppressed commercially. But who were the promoters? People like Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, the entire Communist Party at a certain level, trying to create a cultural form that would be opposed from blanket commercialism. I'm not indicting blanket commercialism because we gave rise to many fantastic performers, whether in the Metropolitan Opera, but just take another. You asked for examples. Alicia Alonso, the Cuban ballerina, 93 years old, today still promoting classical and Cuban forms of art. I mean, we could just go on. So the indictment is not correct. I mean, we need analysis, we need challenge, but blanket indictment has to be measured in terms of historical reality.
Now, endorsement is not a way of civilization.
Now, if you look, for example, at socialist realism, I mean, that of course is a straitjacket. A straitjacket.
Art form.
But that's an opinion. But it's a straitjacket, right? If you didn't do it the Stalinist way, to the Gulag, you know, but that had to be repressed autocratically. It had to oppress the culture of the people to create a form. It's good that you bring this up because this is another vital area. Commercialization canalizes culture into the forms it needs. All you have to do is go to Chase Manhattan Bank, Chase Manhattan Plaza, down on Wall Street near the Fed, and look at the monstrosity that the Rockefellers created. When Diego Rivera had his murals torn down in
Rockefeller
Plaza because it offended the old dude. The Rockefeller family, after he couldn't make out with Nelson Rockefeller, after he couldn't make out with Frida Kahlo, they decided that they're going to go to abstract art, which says nothing to the people.
I mean, we need an analysis, not an indictment. Thank you.
Can I say something about that too? Actually, in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, there was a great flourishing of modern art and architecture.
The greatest.
Wait, can I finish?
I said the greatest, I'm agreeing with you.
Well,
And it was crushed.
okay.
It was destroyed.
May I please finish? Stalin said, we have to get rid of this because this isn't what the peasants want. They want old-fashioned things. They want classical ballet. They don't want Isadora Duncan or Martha Graham or people like that, which was Marxist dancing. They want to go back to the classical ballet of the aristocratic period with co-dancing. They said, Stalin said, no,
Is that why
people
the
will not
lawyer
understand
fled?
this modern art. So it's true that in that period, modern art that was flourishing was definitely repressed, but that's just only one place in one country. We have to look at events in other countries too. Bulgaria, East Germany, there are many, many forms of art that managed to flourish under communist systems. I mean, we have to get a bibliography of it and show it, but it wasn't necessarily worse than capitalist culture. Capitalist culture can be pretty bad.
Yeah, can I just share a reflection on this exchange that just went on? We heard Arturo calling out the names of art movements, of artists and so on, that most of you have never heard of.
Yeah.
You know, giving us a glimpse into a world of culture that we've been denied access to. Our access to culture has been through commercial, commodified culture to a surprising extent. You know, for so many of the younger generation especially, culture means Disneyland. It means popular movies. It means video games, etc. You know that's their conception of culture, because that's what's promoted as commodities. But other forms of culture do not get disseminated massively, and you know the fact that we don't recognize a lot of what was just mentioned to us is testimony to that. Yeah. No.
Just a case. Kerouac and his buddies came to San Miguel and had a ball and wrote poetry and flourished a great movement of literary creation in the States because of the GI Bill. Had there been no GI Bill, you couldn't have gotten to San Miguel to get an art degree. WPA gave us Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie and
a lot of murals and a lot of murals in the post offices.
Artists are vulnerable. All they do is give. They don't. They want to make love to the people. Decent cultures support that. Seems to me. So I think culture and socialism go very well together.
I have to add something to that. I felt the WPA artists had more freedom to criticize the government and society than the artists who are now funded by foundations, which many of them are. They are not free, and this goes on all over the world. The Ford Foundation funds popular theater in the Philippines, for example. but they're not allowed to criticize imperialism or capitalism. They can put on plays about relations between the sexes and drunken people and things like that. But they are no longer allowed to use their drama to criticize the basic elements of their system. And that is true generally of almost all foundation funding. You can do weird things, you can pierce your body, that's all right. You know, throw excrement on things. It's art. That's all, they don't mind that. But criticizing capitalism doesn't happen under the foundation-funded system.
Yeah, Marty.
John, I would be very pleased if you were, when you finish your program in the 1820s, communitarians, if you would give us a similar exposure to all these questions you brought up, about 20 different questions, that is subsequent week. I will cheer to it.
I came here to rest. I live here, so these are
You could rest.
okay.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you
Yeah.
is, I came here for a definition of what is a socialist.
Yeah.
And so I hear variations on social democracy is what I'm hearing, where the Canadians are perfectly comfortable spending a little bit more and spreading the net out, such as tuition in the colleges. I don't see beggars on the streets in Victoria especially.
We do.
Well, I guess you do on the right street. But in general, we spend 30% of our gross domestic product on governmental services of various sorts, and the rest 70% produces the profit that supports the 30%, plus deficit financing, of course. So any way you go, that I've heard so far, is does the 30% get the 34% or 36%? Denmark's 38%. These are all variations on social democracies. But it's capitalism that generates the bucks, that feeds the system. So that's where I get confused. I asked in passing Cliff the other day, how do you put this together? Is a kibbutz a socialist environment? Is there a government that's a socialist environment? Is a fishing co-op a socialist environment? Is my dad's trade union in New York a socialist environment? These are some of the questions you touched, and 20 others.
Yeah, I believe that people collectively have to define what socialism is, what it should be, how to deal with these problems. I don't think one person could say what socialism is. I laid down the law, this is socialism. I think there should be a lot more work of groups of people to deal with these questions.
Well, let's start. Stick around.
We can't do it right here, but certainly, yeah, and I'm not, by the way, I'm a socialist, so it isn't that I'm saying that it can't work. I'm saying before we can define it and move ahead, we have to deal with these unpleasant questions. Now, where I live in New Hampshire, the largest manufacturing industry is BAE Systems, which a lot of people have never heard of.
Military contract.
It's military production. It's the largest military producer in Europe.
In New Hampshire?
And it has a branch in New Hampshire. It has a headquarters local headquarters in New Hampshire. And it's foreign owned. So if you're going to be if you want to socialize, you get into trouble. It's foreign owned. BAE, they produce weapons of all kinds, and it's the largest one. We have many others. We have headquarters of Elbit Systems, which is an Israeli-owned company that has built the wall in Israel and is now helping to build the wall in the United States. There's also an Italian company, Finmeccanica, and many others. Some are owned by the United States. General Dynamics is a Chicago firm, and they were very important in the rise of Obama. Yeah. They were his sponsors. that's different from all the other companies, all the other military companies, because it's been owned by Jewish people. And so they're also very pro-Israel. And, you know, these are some of the problems you have to deal with. If you're talking about workers and workers' control and capitalism, this is a big, big industry in the United States. And it infiltrates everything. They're not just making weapons. They're doing every kind of thing. The city I live in, Keene, New Hampshire, the largest military contractor is CNS Wholesale Grocers.
Wow.
And that is the largest military contractor in my city. They produce food packages, whatever it is.
Rations.
Free rations
Yeah.
that go all over the world for our military and also for the contractors. And that's another thing. So much of our military and our intelligence services are now performed by contractors, by capitalists. They're not even governmental anymore. So we've gone a long way to privatization.
Yeah.
So that has to be, you know, dealt with.
So how would you replace that?
Oh gosh, if I knew, I'd be rich.
So who's going to package the rations?
Why do we need rations? Isn't
Why
the
do we need
difference
to-
between Canada and Denmark and the US is their military part of the budget is minuscule compared to what the United States is. The United States has been pouring its treasure out into the world, fighting these ridiculous wars, and now that they've contracted it to these private companies, we essentially have corporate statism, really. I mean, the largest homes around Washington, D.C. now belong to people that work for or own these military contractors. They've created a whole new mega mansion thing all around Washington, D.C. That's the money in the U.S. economy. We don't make anything anymore but bombs and munitions and
we make
weapons.
a few other things. Now, and drugs are a very important industry. Pornography is a very important industry. A lot of money comes in that way. It doesn't always show up on the budgets and balance sheets, but those industries are very important.
We need to wrap this up with some concluding remarks. Bill wanted to say something.
But thank you very much, Cliff, for the privilege of being here with you, Joan, and all of you. The question of a definition of socialism, Arnie, that I thought that I led off with in my turn, is a definition that has to be formulated, as Joan suggested, collectively in a process of doing. What we do with a consciousness of fulfilling human need in new ways creates the conditions of our collective change. Just as we were talking, for example, about tourism. In a changing cultural environment, perhaps tourism for elderly people and tourism for very young people begins to take on a new character which may not impact the environment, whether with backpacks or jet streams. However, as part of a conclusion to a new opening, I would like to submit that in our course of speaking to each other in meaningful ways, whether we disagree, as that fellow in the back, a challenge, and those challenges are extremely important, or we agree, there are going to be refinements which are absolutely essential in terms of how we behave toward each other. How we change the entire environment of notions of criminal behavior. How we punish real criminal behavior, for example. So I only submit, because this is a discussion that is going to go on at least for the rest of our lives, is that we try to look at the particulars of history, we evaluate the particulars of history to give rise to a change, a necessary change in theory, which will be informed repeatedly
by principled practices of self-control, conscious people of what they want. It's an educational project in participation, active participation, of engagement with one another. Because one of the most important things that succeeded early French socialism in all its elan, in all its fervor, from Fourier to George Sorel, was the refinement of the development of a theory of where to go and how to go. Then we go, and as we go, we correct our theory. That will be socialism, not the haphazard development of capital, with all its secondary mediations, which are absolutely necessary to capitalism to survive, from exchange value to the nuclear family, where Jones said, for example, I play on your, that we have to have a whole new concept of family. Maybe it's the extended family, maybe it's tribes, but we will give rise collectively to a new kind of creativity which we must test in our principled practice.
Bill?
Just a very quick comment. I'm glad we started out with Bernie Sanders. Because I'm looking at those 12 principles in light of what you talked about very theoretically and historically and personally. I'm looking to Sanders perhaps with a new definition of socialism. And those 12 points are very democratically oriented. They're common sense. They're basic principles that we want. So I'm pleased with today's presentation. Working on a definition, and Bernie needs to get that out because as a democratic socialist, it would be more appealing than a socialist from a theoretical and historical point. Sorry for going on.
Well,
Democratic socialist.
yeah, we've had, I think, a very fruitful discussion, and I thank you all for participating in it. It is a discussion that will continue to go on. For example, on the 2nd of February, we will be showing Michael Moore's new film, which actually takes up many of these questions of, what kind of a future society would we like to see? And basically, I think that, if you think of socialism not as a finished thing that can be defined succinctly in a dictionary fashion, but rather as a historical process of people, not capital, but people trying to create institutions and practices that meet their needs. That's going to be a long historical process. We are at an important stage going down that road, and that's why these discussions are so important. We're participating in an ongoing historical process. Thank you very much.